Good day. It's Rhonda here again, reading to you from the book, The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins. Today's chapter is 3.1, Singing a Dirge. A sudden shift in tone awaits the reader of Q2. The new temperament is so strongly profiled that a comparison with the sayings in Q1 is unavoidable, and the contrast in mood overwhelming. Excuse me. It is a shift for which one has not been prepared, and the effect is stunning. The aphoristic style of Q1 falls away almost to the point of disappearing. Aphoristic imperatives are gone, as is the sense of confidence in God's care derived from the way in which nature provides for basic needs. In its place, one hears the voice of a prophet pronouncing judgment on a recalcitrant world, a prophet who does not refrain from castigation and the sledge of apocalyptic threat. The shift in tone is matched by a panoply of new forms of speech. In contrast to Q1, the reader now encounters narratives, dialogue, controversy, stories, examples taken from epic tradition, descriptive parables, warnings, and apocalyptic announcements. If one looks for corresponding changes in the rhetoric and style of discourse, one is not disappointed. Instead of exhortation, meaning don't worry, there is pronouncement, meaning the last will be first and the first will be last. Instead of imperatives, such as love your enemies, there is direct statement. I came to strike fire on the earth. Indirect address, who then is the faithful servant, is interspersed with direct address. You must be ready. Formulas of reciprocity, such as the standard you use is the standard used against you, are tightened and shift their setting of consequence from what happens in the public sphere to what will happen in the kingdom of God. And all these judgments and verdicts are rendered with an authority that which does not brook appeal. New ideas also are encountered. The expanded horizon induces figures from the epic tradition. A man named John enters the picture. There is reference to the wisdom of God and the Holy Spirit. There are two miracle stories and warnings about what to say when put on trial. The rule of God is now spoken of as a kingdom to be fully revealed at some other place and time, presumably at the end of time. Sorry, I lost my place. And a final judgment is described, replete with thrones, court scenes, banishments, and a threatening figure called the Son of Man. A listing of the major blocks of material in Q2 illustrates the shift that took place in the constant presence of the theme of judgment. Number 1, John's preaching. QS3, the appearance of John. QS4, John's address to the people. QS5, John's prediction of someone to come. Number 2, what John and Jesus thought about each other. Q5, QS15, the occasion. QS16, John's inquiry. QS17, what Jesus said about John. QS18, what Jesus said about this generation. Number 3, pronouncements against towns that reject the movement. QS21, the unreceptive town. QS22, the Galilean towns. Number 4, congratulations to those who accept the movement. QS23, on the one who receives the worker. QS25, on the one who hears and sees. Number 5, controversy with this generation. QS28, on kingdoms and conflict. Number 6, making sure whose side you're on. QS29, those for and those against. QS30, the return of an evil spirit. Number 7, judgment on this generation. QS32, the sign of Jonah. Number 8, true enlightenment. That's QS33, the lamp and the eye. Number 9, pronouncements against the Pharisees. QS34, O you Pharisees. Number 10, on anxiety and speaking out. QS37, on public confessions. Number 11, the coming judgment. QS41, the hour. QS42, on faithfulness. QS43, fire and division. QS44, signs of the times. QS45, settling accounts. Number 12, the two ways. QS47, the narrow gate and closed door. QS48, exclusion from the kingdom. Number 13, community rules. QS54, when to rejoice. QS55, either or. QS57, on scandals. QS58, on forgiveness. QS59, on faith. And number 14, the final judgment. QS60, the day of separation. QS61, squaring accounts. The theme of judgment is very closely related to an apocalyptic imagination. The threat of coming up short in a final judgment flows like an undercurrent from the preaching of John to the parable of the talents. Many of the prophetic pronouncements, image of destruction, and the parables of exclusion take their seriousness from this apocalyptic backdrop, even when it is not made explicit. It is also the apocalyptic framework that forced a reconception of God and made it possible to imagine the rule of God as a realm to be fully revealed only at the end of time. The inverse is also true. However, and this is an important point to understand, the apocalyptic imagination is very closely related to the theme of judgment. If one compares the apocalyptic language in Q2 with the way it is commonly used in the apocalyptic literature of the time, the features that are missing in Q2 are remarkable. There's very little interest in imagining the rule of God as a glorious kingdom of the end time. In Q2, the final trial is focused upon personal vindication or condemnation, making sure who is in and who is out of the kingdom. The last judgment does not function to vindicate a sectarian group at the expense of the destruction of its enemies. Also, there is no hint of fascination with an end-time scenario in order to imagine what it will take to rescue the righteous from an impossible world or create a better world to replace it. For the people of Q, there was little comfort to be derived from the thought of a final judgment. There is no hint of a personal piety grounded in an apocalyptic hope or an eventual transformation. There is no indication that the Q community closed its borders on the world and stiffened to prepare for a dramatic change of circumstance. The apocalyptic imagination served only one purpose for the people of Q, and that was to guarantee the threat of judgment that they wanted to bring down upon people who had frustrated their mission. That was all. Thus, in spite of the potentially overwhelming apocalyptic frame of reference in Q2, there's actually much more interest invested in the substantive issues of self-definition and loyalty to the movement than there is in seeing these issues solved at a final judgment. It is obvious that the people of Q were distressed and incensed, and that they had targeted certain people such as the Pharisees for their fire, but they were not in the process of becoming an enclave, conventicle, or apocalyptic community. They put the language of apocalyptic to use only in order to put muscle into their judgments upon the present state of their world. The beauty of an apocalyptic projection was that it could turn a contemporary critic or a charge into a threat with a tinge of ultimacy. You will surely get your just deserts. What was the problem that called forth such wrath and created such a shift of discourse between Q1 and Q2? It must have been related to something which happened in the social history of the people of Q, and some clues are present in the shift of discourse itself. In contrast to Q1, where all sayings were addressed to the followers of Jesus as a group and served to instruct them as individuals in their project of representing God's kingdom in the world, Q2 includes a large number of sayings that address the world at large. Some of these sayings are indirectly addressed to outsiders, as if hoping that the whole world might overhear what is being said. Such is the case with the sayings in QS 32 to the effect that this generation is wicked, quote unquote. But many sayings address those outside the movement directly, as if they were present for the speeches. Examples would be the sayings in QS 22 and QS 34. Woe for you, Chorazin! Shame on you, Pharisees! What is said about those addressed in this way is significant. Excuse me. There is of the offspring of vipers in this wicked generation that did not change its mind. QS 4, QS 32. Of this generation that did not join in the dance of the morning. QS 18. Of cities like Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum that were too haughty to change their ways. QS 20, QS 22. And of lawyers and Pharisees who refused to enter God's kingdom because of their position of privilege, and who kept others from entering as well by means of their own rules for staying pure. QS 34. These are sharp sayings, and they are shouted for the whole world to hear, like Roman candles shot against the night sky, exploding and blanketing the entire region of Galilee with their sparks. But the nature of their message, rhetoric, and style belies the author's ruse. It is very clear that the authors knew they were shouting into the wind. You can almost see them in the process of formulating what they wished they had said to those who had raised their ire. Oh, you Pharisees, look at all the ways you've been wrong. But the manner of the charge is not calculated for persuasion. If there ever had been a real confrontation, it was now a thing of the past. The premises on which the charges are based are exactly those that have been rejected when the real debate broke down. The people of Q held their position but lost the argument. Real Pharisees were no longer in earshot, at least not any who were worth their Jewish salt. The scolding as it now stands sounds like a one-sided shouting match, and no one puts up unless the family resemblance won't let you leave. Unfortunately for the people of Q, their audience had already turned away. Rejection then turns out to be the cause of the wrath as well as the point of the charge. Is it possible to understand how the people of Q got themselves in such a mess? Judging from the lifestyle characteristic for Q1, the Jesus people could have experienced rejection for any number of reasons. The people of Q could have appeared silly or tiring, a bit unnerving, or even too dangerous for close association. But rejection for such reasons should have been taken in stride. Many of the Q1 instructions are addressed precisely to the situation of reproach in public, and none of them recommends wrath. So something else must have happened. Taking notice of two additional features of Q2 will put us on the right track. One is the indication that loyalty to the movement had become a very serious issue. The definition of a faithful follower had been raised, and worry about the movement losing members had become an all-consuming concern. The other is that the evidence for social stress comes to focus upon the pain experienced in the rupture of the human bonds and relationships. There is mention of tension internal to the group and division within families. There are also threats of exclusion from the kingdom of God, noting that the concern about loyalty, the matter of division, and the castigation of an unsympathetic world are all indications of social stress. An extremely troubled phase of the movement's social history unfolds. One can mark the increase in concern about the loyalty by paying attention to the way in which mutual recognition was measured. In the very earliest stages of the movement, stages 1 and 2, it was sufficient to talk about keeping Jesus' words. That was what the movement was about. And those who did keep the words, who were interested and willing to talk and act in accord with them, were easily recognized as being Jesus' people. As the movement spread, however, mutual recognition became more of a problem. As Q1 shows, houses of hospitality formed and a sense of mission emerged. The standard for recognition, quote unquote, keeping the words of Jesus, did not change. But a growing emphasis on the importance of doing so is noticeable. And yet, who among the Jesus people could put such a concern into one's own words? And with what authority? The experimental nature of the movement would have made it difficult for any would-be leader to stand up and say, if you do not keep Jesus's words, you are not helping the cause, or you are not really one of us, or you are out. But Jesus might be imagined to have said such things. After all, the figure of Jesus as founder of the movement and the voice of Jesus as authority for the community's instruction were already taken for granted. However, to imagine Jesus giving additional instruction about himself, saying how important his own teachings were, or saying that one had to keep them in order to be a true follower, would have greatly advanced the importance of Jesus in comparison to earlier understandings of his significance as a teacher. The resulting image of Jesus would have had tremendous consequences for the kind of authority Jesus had for the movement, recasting his role from that of a cynic-like teacher who espoused a way of life that any and all might try, to that of an authoritative model, judge, and keeper of accounts. For now, Jesus would refer to himself as his own authority. set forth his teachings as community code, and accept as a matter of course his own importance as the one who intended from the first to set the standard for what the movement must become. And so it happened that concern for measuring loyalty to the teachings of the movement turned Jesus into the founder of the movement. This enhancement of the authority of Jesus took place by degrees. The first development in this direction can be seen already in the statements that Jesus makes about himself at stage 2 of this social history. It would be helpful to notice the importance of these sayings in Q1 before going on to the subsequent developments in Q2. Thus, fully in keeping with the genre of instruction, we have the following formulations in Q1. Why do you call me master and not do what I say? That's in QS 14. Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them is like a man who built a house on rock. That's in QS 14. Look, I send you out as lambs among wolves. QS 20. Sir, who made me your judge or lawyer? QS 38. Notice that Jesus refers to himself as the instructor of sayings and injunctions that have become standards for the self-definition of the movement. This registers the first and most fundamental shift in the enhancement of Jesus' image and authority. QS 38 is most interesting in this regard, for it names an issue over which Jesus' words do not have authority, and thus reveals the desire to limit Jesus' authority to masters of instruction for and loyalty to the movement. As for QS 14, the instructions Jesus refers to as what I say are none other than the sayings contained in Q1 as a whole. A second advance in the self-authorization of Jesus' instructions can be seen in two other clusters of sayings, both of which appear to be later developments in the compositional history of Q. How fortunate you are when they reproach you because of me. QS 8. Whoever does not hate his father and mother will not be able to learn from me. QS 52. Whoever does not accept his cross and so become my follower cannot be one of my students. QS 52. These sayings fit best in the period between the collection of most Q1 materials and the revision in Q2. I shall call this intermediate period stage 3. The saying in QS8 is a statement modeled on the preceding 3 pronouncements of fortunate status or honor and must have been added at some later time. It breaks the pattern of the first 3 pronouncements and provides the basis for yet another saying about the prophets at the Q2 level of composition, a motif to which we shall return. QS 52 is a cluster of sayings at the very end of Q1, likely candidates and a likely place for additions to the collection just prior to the programmatic revisions characteristic for Q2. These sayings signal the direction in which the Q2 people were to move as they measured loyalty to their movement. Note that the behavior enjoined in QS8 and QS52 is still a matter of personal performance in keeping with the movement's standards of recognition. One is to rejoice when reproached, disentangle family ties, accept one's cross, meaning bear up under condemnation, and not allow the fear of being killed to affect loyalty to the movement. Although all of these are extreme cases of having one's mettle tested, thus reflecting a time of distress for the Jesus people, none was unusual for the Cynic tradition on which the Jesus movement drew. All occur in the Cynic tradition as examples of testing personal integrity. The sayings in QS 52 about losing one's life in order to preserve it had a long proverbial history behind it, and the cross had become a metaphor for the ultimate test of a philosopher's integrity. The injunction to take up one's cross in order to be a true follower of Jesus need not be taken as an oblique reference to Jesus' own death, the cause and occasion for which are not at all certain, despite the customary assumption of crucifixion. Even if the saying were so taken, however, it would only mean that the people of Q viewed Jesus' death in the same light as that accorded other well-known examples of courage in the face of threats to one's life. Thus, Jesus' crucifixion would have served the people of Q as an example of the integrity required of any of his followers, an integrity that was still being measured by the commitment to the way of life enjoined within the movement. And yet, a slight but important shift in focus from the teachings to the teacher can be detected in QS 8 and QS 52. In these sayings, loyalty to the movement is expressed not in terms of keeping Jesus' words, but in terms of behavior befitting a true follower of Jesus, or staying true to the movement because of Jesus. Jesus is viewed as the founder teacher who exemplified his own teachings and thus made a personal investment in the movement. And being a true follower can easily shift yet another notch to include the notion of loyalty to Jesus himself. Consider now the following statements from Q2. Fortunate is the one who is not disturbed at hearing these things about me. QS 16. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. QS 23. How fortunate are the eyes that see what you see. QS 25. If I exorcise demons by the finger of God, then God's rule has caught up with you. QS 28. Whoever is not with me is against me, and the one who does not gather with me scatters. QS 29. Everyone who admits in public that they know me, the Son of Man will acknowledge before the angels of God. The one who disowns me in public, the Son of Man will disown before the angels of God. QS 37. These statements are not the ones in Q2 that address the question of loyalty to the movement, but they suffice to show that the question of loyalty had become an extremely important issue, and that loyalty to the movement could now be expressed in terms of loyalty to Jesus, not just in terms of keeping his words. Keeping his words was still the fundamental sign of recognition, but Jesus was now imagined to speak in roles other than that of a teacher. Jesus had become the founder of a movement with a programmatic mission. Faithfulness to the movement could be expressed in terms of admitting that one knew Jesus. Admitting that one was a Jesus person was now a matter of some consequence. This concern for loyalty to the movement is matched by signs of social distress. Tensions within the movement are indicated by the saying on scandals in QS 57 and the instruction to forgive a brother if he has a change of heart in QS 58. But changes of heart have apparently not been the rule. Families have been torn asunder, and the divisions have been rationalized as fully in keeping with the importance and purpose of the movement. Painful? Yes, but to be expected. Do you think that I have come to bring peace on earth? No, not peace, but a sword. For I have come to create conflict between a man and his father, disagreement between a daughter and her mother, and estrangement between a daughter-in-law and her mother-in-law. A person's enemies will be one's own kin. QS 43. This pronouncement turns painful experience into programmatic purpose. It is quite different than the cynic-like saying in Q1 about rejecting one's family in order to be a follower of Jesus, QS 52. In Q2, families have been split over loyalty to the movement. This means that rejection is now working the other way around, and the signs of division do not stop there. The children in the marketplace have said no to the music of the movement. The missionaries have experienced rejection. The story of the Beelzebul accusation in QS 28 is about rejection, conflict, and labeling Jesus and his followers as agents of a foreign or Syrian god. Jesus' retort about your sons turns the challenge back upon his questioners and directs the issue of conflict to the social world that Jesus shares with them. There are instructions in QS 37 and QS 45 about what to do in case one is called before the village authorities. And there are several examples taken from the epic tradition of the Hebrew Bible in QS 32, QS 34, and QS 60 that are used to illustrate the divisive consequences of refusing to listen to sage and or prophetic advice. The language of divisive conflict is very closely related to another theme that is even more important for our purposes. This is the theme of inclusion versus exclusion, a theme that presupposes the notion of boundaries and borders. The people of Q2 had not organized their movement to become a society with membership requirements and officers, much less with rights of entrance. But the rule of God that they represented was certainly in the process of being reconceived as a discrete domain or kingdom. And there was now a great deal of talk about entering into the kingdom or being excluded from it. The least in the kingdom are greater than John, QS 17. The lawyers have shut the kingdom of a God against the people and prevented the people from going in, QS 34. The faithful servant will be given charge of the master's estate, QS 42. One should strive to enter the narrow door, QS 47. And in the kingdom of God, the last will be first and the first will be last, QS 48. Reading more closely, one sees that loyalty to the Jesus movement had run up against the challenge of Jewish propriety and the question of belonging to the people of God as the children of Abraham or Israel. And the Jesus people had taken this challenge seriously. The evidence for this includes the repeated appeals to biblical traditions. The preaching of John about the children of Abraham, the import of the Beelzebul accusation, and the list of countercharges leveled against Pharisees and lawyers or scribes. This challenge to the movement stiffened. The debate The debate apparently came to focus on the difference between the lifestyle of the Jesus people and the Jewish codes of purity advocated by the Pharisees. The term Pharisee appears to have been a label meaning purists, referring to their type of piety. The Pharisees had worked out an innovative response to the troubled times in Palestine from a thoroughly Jewish perspective. The temple establishment had lost its legitimacy and the sacrificial system its efficacy. But now one could still be true to the Jewish heritage by following a code for ritual purity as an individual. Thus, the Pharisaic code also defined a lifestyle. Their code consisted of a small list of rituals such as tithing, prayers, fasting, and giving to charity, in combination with a number of cleanliness rules, such as washings and the selection of foods. These codes were not laws, quote unquote, for they had no institutional base of promulgation. Pharisees were simply a class of individuals who lived by this code as a way to define themselves as Jewish. Whether or not there were many Pharisees living in Galilee, their code would have been well known as one way to mark Jewish identity. The Jesus people ran afoul of the Pharisaic code and were challenged for doing so. They in turn singled out the Pharisees as their chief critics. Conflict with the Pharisees does not mean that the Jesus movement intended a reform of Judaism, or that it was generated by a claim to represent a biblical heritage or ideal. Neither does it mean that the Jesus movement was made up only of Jews who happened to be living in Galilee. But some members of the Jesus movement might have been Galilean Jews because the issue of loyalty came to be phrased as a Jewish question, was taken very seriously, and was eventually answered on Jewish terms. Excuse me. One can easily understand how this situation might have developed if loyalties to the Jesus movement began to wear and tear at the fabric of families and villages in which Jewish sensibilities were strong. One can imagine a family worried about the involvement of some of its members in the Jesus movement. Attempts at dissuasion could have and must have taken many forms, but insisting on traditional family loyalties, throwing up Pharisaic standards, and making arguments for preserving Jewish identity were apparently the ploys that struck home. They were in any case the ones that got a response from the Q people, and they triggered a spate of countercharges that determined the emerging self-identification of the Jesus movement. The indications are that the inner family, inner village debates on matters such as these were very lively and vociferous before all parties agreed to disagree. The charges against the Pharisees and lawyers in QS 34 are especially interesting in this regard. The issues under debate were just what one might expect: washings, giving to a charity, tithes, justice, honor, and knowledge. The list combines items typical for the Pharisaic code of ritual purity with items for which scribal representatives of the temple system of courts and taxation would be known. Such standards had apparently been held up as exemplary by families and village leaders seeking to chide their Jesus people into postures of propriety. Apparently, the people of Q were not impressed. They regarded the Pharisaic codes as foolish and the lawyer's justice as burdensome. True to their cynic heritage, the Jesus people were still capable of engaging in a bit of caustic riposte. The Pharisees were like tombs, so much for their desire to be honored, and the lawyers treated people like beasts of burden, so much for their claims to know the law and administer justice. And so the debate must have gone ad hoc volleys, largely missing their targets, but nonetheless expressing firm convictions on either side of the match. But then the ante was upped. Lo and behold, the people of Q linked the Pharisees and lawyers to the history of what their fathers did to the prophets. The Q people even crafted an oracle of the wisdom of God, saying that this present generation would be held accountable for the blood of all the prophets. QS 34. That is some ante. Suddenly, we're swept into a world of fantastic imagination, stupendous claim, and grand methodology. Hold on, I'll get this out. Mythologization. It's the best I can do. It is clear that the offense had registered, and the defense would be to beat the Jewish exemplars at their own game. The Jesus movement must have been worth it in the eyes of those who now turned to the intellectual labor of myth-making. They had to find ways to read the biblical epic as if it registered a devastating criticism of the Pharisees. In sorting through the scriptural traditions, they also looked for self-justifying arguments, examples in support of their own movement. This amounted to an implicit claim upon the cultural heritage represented by epic tradition, a claim that would only have made sense if the Jesus people had become a distinct group and were now willing to see themselves reflected in the traditions of Israel. Some at least were thinking that the Jesus movement had become more than a forum for social critique, more than a support group for persons wanting to stand tall in unsettling times. A community had formed to seek its own identity in contrast to other social, ethnic, and cultural configurations. But what a reading of the biblical traditions! There's very little evidence for actual literary activity in regard to the scriptures as texts, and none whatsoever for interest in redirecting any of the major ideological themes of the Hebrew scriptures to run in favor of the Jesus movement. There is no appeal to such important themes as the promises to the patriarchs, the priestly covenants, the Mosaic law, the land, the Davidic covenant, Leviticus charter for the temple cult, and the prophetic visions of a return to Jerusalem. most of most of the allusions to the epic of Israel, such as the references to Solomon and Jonah, are best understood as taken from popular oral lore. And there is a subversive strategy detectable in the selection of only these examples. It is almost as if, when challenged by a Jewish orthodoxy, the Galileans appealed to what they knew of the popular epic traditions of Israel, generally shared by Jews, Samaritans, and Galileans. These traditions were available to all the people of Semitic extraction throughout Palestine, though in different forms. And of course, each Palestinian province would have remembered the history in different ways. The people of Q worked these stories to their own advantage on the other one hand, and to the detriment of their detractors' claims to represent the true form of Israel on the other. We have already seen that this generation was linked to the fathers who killed all the prophets from Abel to Zechariah, QS 34, and that the Jesus people were encouraged to think of themselves as fortunate because they were treated just as the prophets had been treated, QS 8, CF, QS 25. The logic was that the epic tradition supported the Jesus people because they, like the prophets, registered appropriate criticism of the status quo. The motif of the killing of the prophets could also be cited to embarrass their detractors because they, just as the fathers always had done to the prophets, were wrongfully persecuting and killing the Jesus people. But the charge was a summary fiction with respect both to the history it summarized and to its application to the Jesus people. It was based on a familiar theme used by conservative Jews at the time to explain why history had gone wrong and to call for a return to proper observance of the Torah of Moses. The way the people of Q used the motif was not a particularly clever manipulation of the Hebrew scriptures or of the logical thrust of the biblical epic. They simply took what there was in the Jewish reservoir of stock images and turned it against their detractors. The charge could not possibly have held if the lawyers and the people of Q had been able and willing to sit down together and actually study the scriptures. So the charge was never designed to persuade the lawyers. It only sounded good to the Jesus people to think of themselves that way. If the fathers had killed all the prophets from Abel on, what about our father Abraham? What about Isaac and Jacob? Well, now the people of Q had not really meant to include those fathers in the charge. The patriarchs were not the private property of the Jews. Samaritans, Galileans, and the Jesus people were also the children of Abraham. And when all the good people gather at the table in the kingdom of God, those who rebuked the Jesus people will have to clench their teeth when they see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of the prophets in and themselves out. QS 48. So that takes care of the problem of the patriarchs and the Pharisees. Or does the mention of Abraham really mean that the Galilean Jesus people thought it important to be children of Abraham? Did not John warn the crowd that it would do no good to count on any ethnic claim to be children of Abraham because God could raise up children for Abraham even from the stones? And as for staking one's claim on belonging to Israel, did not Jesus tell the Roman centurion that the centurion's response to Jesus' words was better than any he had found in all of Israel? So what did the Q people intend by making such confusing references to the epic tradition of Israel? What the Q people accomplished in their appeal to biblical examples was not a coherent rereading of the epic in their favor. Their achievement was a popping of pompous balloons and a freaky delight in seeing themselves reflected in the story at its most embarrassing turns. Think of Jonah. Were the Ninevites Jews? No. Did they not repent at Jonah's preaching? Yes. Now think of Jesus and the Jesus movement in the very same light, only brighter. Remember the Queen of the South, Sheba. Was she a Jew? No. Did Solomon withhold his wisdom from her? No. See, something greater even than Solomon is here. In the story of Noah, be careful whose side you're on. Everyone else perished, you know. It is going to be the same story when the Son of Man appears. And the same goes for Lot and the city of Sodom. He was called out. They were destroyed. QS 60, QS 21. So there is your epic. They seemed to be saying, if you want to know what we are about, read it. This strategy is quite similar to that used with the apocalyptic threat. The people of Q were not particularly enamored of thinking about themselves in the idiom of apocalyptic. Their movement certainly was not generated by an apocalyptic hysteria or persuasion of imminent judgment, any more than it was by a drive to reform or restore some ethnic identity based on the promise inherent in the biblical epic of Israel. In both cases, the appeal to examples from the epic and the threat of an apocalyptic judgment, the Q people invaded the territory of their Jewish detractors and used their own idioms against them. And yet, once involved in such an imaginative exercise, polemical as it surely was at first, a curious fascination with the broadened horizon seems to have developed. To think of the Jesus movement taking its place in the grand scheme of things, from the very foundation of the world, QS 34, to the day when the Son of Man appears, QS 60, was not a bad idea. No one could have started either with the thrust of the Hebrew epic or with the pull of an apocalyptic hope and come up with a plan for just such a movement as the Jesus movement. But once it was there as a movement in the process of social formation, worthy of the loyalties of those within and threatened by the cuffs of those without, finding a place in the sun was exactly what the movement needed. And what a place to take, aligned with the little ones whose pedigree reached back to the beginning and who already knew in advance how the final judgment would go. Thus, there is more than a hint of delight in seeing the Jesus people on the right side of things as the epic history was reviewed and the apocalyptic finale imagined. The strategy of turning the history and vision this way, and that to catch one's own reflection in some unexpected facet of the grand design, can be seen in the selections that were made. From the epic, the authors of Q2 had selected a few well-known stories that could work both ways, as a warning to their detractors and as a subtle suggestion that the epic of Israel championed the lone figures and marginal peoples. In the case of the final judgment, it wasn't as easy to picture the traditional scene working out in their favor. But by taking care of one's descriptions, the outline of an answer began to emerge. Why not think of God, whose judgment would be final, with a copy of Q in his hands as his guide? But myth-making demands much more. Connections need to be made among many historical moments, including the present time, and a place must be secured for the new community in relation to other peoples and their cultures. The sweep of history needs to have its rhyme and reason, coursing through the present situation, and the Archimedean point to vantage for comprehending the whole has to be located. The authors of Q2 were not quite there, but they had laid some firm foundations. In order to make the connection with all that had gone before, they appropriated the mythological figure of the wisdom of God. In order to make the connection with what was to come, they cleverly manipulated the description of the Son of Man. And in order to join these two mythological figures exactly where they had to be joined, the people of Q reimagined Jesus as the child of wisdom and as the seer who knew what the Son of Man would say at the end of time. Each of these mythological developments deserves some discussion, for taken together they put us in touch with an amazing accomplishment. The people of Q created a myth of broad horizon by elaborating the unlikely genre of the sayings of a sage. And that ends part 3.2, Singing a Dirge, from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q, and Christian Origins by Burton L. Matt. I do hope you enjoyed this reading, and stay tuned for the next part, Claiming a Place. Good day.